All right, so I think we'll get started. Does that sound like a good idea? Yeah, okay. So hello and welcome everyone to the second panel for the And Others project with Lina Džuverović as the research director of this project. My name is Rebecca Cupid. I'm co-director of BERMAC, the Centre for Interdisciplinary Research in Media and Culture, which is housed at the School of Arts at Birkbeck University of London. And we're co-hosting this panel that Lina has organised. So Lina also co-directs BERMAC with me, and there's a nice synergy between the research projects that we both do and the other research that's going on at the centre. So at the moment, we're basically focusing on the kinds of interdisciplinary research into media and culture that deals with things like digital archives, multi-species encounters, decolonial feminisms, and even a little bit of research coming up on memory and place. So that's about BERMAC. So for tonight, just for this online session, I'll just ask you to all mute your microphones if you're not presenting. We're also recording this session, and the recording will be available on the BERMAC website and the And Others website. So we'll be going until 6:30 p.m. And the discussion we'll open up the floor for discussion around 6 o'clock. So hopefully we'll have a lot of time for discussion. If you have questions during any of the presentations, feel free to add them to the chat. Or once the presentations are over, please just, unmute your mic, put your camera on, and if you like, you can raise your hand. So I think that's it. I'll hand it over to you, Lina, and to all the presenters. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. So I'm going to say a little bit about the project before introducing the panelists this evening. So my name is Lina Džuverović, and I am the main researcher for this project. The project started around, officially, you could say around 2019, and it emerges out of my research initially in the on the territory of the former Yugoslavia, which is where I've done a lot of research and including my PhD. And that involved researching a lot of artist collectives, which were emerging on that territory during the period of socialist Yugoslavia, in line with self-managed socialism. So the kind of idea of collectivity was central socially, not just in terms of art, but in a broader sense as well. So a lot of artists were working collectively. And the research emerges out of me really coming across many collectives and groups and seeing a very obvious discrepancy between authorship, crediting, and participation. In other words, seeing a lot of artists who were working collectively. The work was often credited to male artists. Often you could see female artists or female participants in the images, in the videos, in the performances, but they were not to be seen in the crediting. So there was this discrepancy between what you saw and what you read and how this work was historicized. So I started to ask some questions about that and found that the answers I was finding were not exactly satisfactory. Usually I was getting responses such as, oh, it was a really sexist period, and oh, it was just like that, it's terrible, but that's how it was, but these were great collectives. And they were. But to me, I wanted to revisit this, and I was genuinely curious about these and others, the invisible participants in these collective endeavors. And I did some interviews, and I realized that it was, for me, became important, partly, of course, to understand individual histories and individual narratives and events around them, but also the question of methods and the methodology around doing this kind of work. And of course, we have a lot of methods coming from feminist art histories and different studies of collectivity. But I really kind of felt that I was kind of hitting a wall in the sense of how these questions were being asked, what kind of questions were being asked. And I decided that, or rather felt that these issues of participation, authorship, crediting, historicization all these questions were bigger than just that period and that geography, that it was much more a question of collectivity on a much broader scale. So I decided to work through a series of questions, kind of bringing together studies of collectivity, feminist art histories, questions of social reproduction theory, and to kind of try to work through these kind of issues, somehow bringing all of this together. And the kind of questions that were emerging were questions to do with network reproduction, network formation, labor, questions of value and how we value different types of work within collective practice, invisible labor like administration, maintenance, also obviously different forms of social reproduction. So when I then at some point in this project, I was awarded a grant by the Center for Arts and Human Rights at Bard, and I decided to try this methodological experiment, in which I wanted to sort of use a collective method to investigate collectivity. And I invited 17 participants, and we have been now for 2 months discussing 4 different kind of clusters of questions, perhaps is best to say, in 4 different conversations on a software tool called Framapad, which is very similar to Google Docs, where we're basically all writing and kind of commenting on each other's writing. And so these are formed into 4 different panels. And I really wanted to kind of see how people that had written about collectivity and these kind of questions worked collectively or work collectively now or work with collectives would be thinking about these kind of questions. So that's what brings us to this panel. And my idea was that we would do this sort of collectively for a couple of months. So we started in, I think it was like July or June, or something like that. And that we would be writing collectively and then close, reflect, and then have a panel discussion. So it's this idea of like a flipped panel discussion, whereby you don't just kind of present and then talk for 20 minutes, but rather we converse for a longer period, get to know each other's practices and thinking, and then kind of have this public sort of occasion to discuss what has been brought up in those Framapads. So today we are, this is the second panel. Some of you might have come to the first one last week, which was very interesting, looking at social reproduction. Today's panel looks at network formation, reproduction, and questions of access. So how a network's formed, who has access, who doesn't, and how that kind of reproduces and develops. And we started with some prompts, and I will ask the panelists to sort of select some of these, but some of the issues that we sort of started with were gaps between ideological beliefs in collectivity and praxis. So examining possible inadvertent reproductions of existing forms of othering and exclusions, so kind of different forms of visibility and invisibility within collective work, questions of formation and reproduction of networks, ways in which cultural organizations work with collectives, so work with many rather than one artist or cultural producer, and also external articulations of collective work and collective practice, so that gap between kind of the internal and the way things work and how it's presented kind of to the outside. So that is the kind of structure of the project, and we are, as I say, on the second out of 4 panels. I will now introduce the panelists. Before I do that, I just want to say thank you to all the partners, because it's been a genuinely participatory and engaged project with a lot of people and organizations who have been really enthusiastic about it, which is great. So Center for Human Rights and the Arts at Bard College, which is part of the Open Society University Network, has funded the project, which has basically made it possible. And then Art Monthly has been a great partner, with Chris McCormack being one of the panelists as well. So it's kind of a collaboration on many levels. And obviously Bermac is being our host, and Birkbeck, and then Electra, an arts organization I'm involved with, has also been supportive. So this evening we have with us Carla Cruz, who is an artist, researcher, and arts lecturer based in Portugal. Lily Hall, who is a curator currently working at the Showroom Gallery in London. Abhijan Toto, who is a curator and writer based between Berlin, Bangkok, and Seoul. Felicity Allen, who is an artist working across painting, writing, and film. And we have manual labors comprised of Sophie Hope and Jenny Richards. Manual Labors is a practice-based research project which explores physical and emotional relationships to work, and it was initiated by Sophie Hope and Jenny Richards. Sophie is my wonderful colleague at Birkbeck, senior lecturer in art policy and management, and Jenny Richards is an organizer based in Sweden and also a PhD student. So that's my formal MC part. So at this point, I just want to start by asking each of you, perhaps in the order that I introduced you, starting with Carla, if you could just start by introducing yourself by saying how you see your practice connecting with this project. What are some of the questions that you've worked on that relate with this project? And secondly, if you could just say how this strange experience of collaborative writing over the past couple of months has been for you. So, Carla.
Hi, good afternoon. I am Carla, I'm an artist. I'm a lecturer in visual arts in the School of Architecture, Art and Design of Minho University in Portugal. I'm based in Porto, where I am at the moment. I lived in London for quite a while, between 2009 and 2018. That's where I met some of you. And I've been interested in collectivity and collaboration and networks from early on in my studies and in my practice. And I think one of the most important aspects for me in collaboration and collectivity has been the question of authorship, of who can claim the role or the position of the artist, which I've always thought is a position of power. And I think my analysis or critique comes originally from a feeling of not belonging as a woman artist. I think from my studies in the Fine Art Academy as a young woman, the models that were presenting to me were of male artists. So I really thought that where was my role within this field? Of course, eventually I realized that the story or the history was not being told in its full in its full picture. But that feeling of not belonging really gave me an entrance into questioning this romantic individualistic notion of the genius artist as a singular being. And then in my own practice, I was trying to deconstruct that. So from early on, oops. Okay.
Is your sound not working?
I feel that I'm gone. I can't see myself. Sorry.
Okay, we can see you. We can see you. We can hear you.
I trying to get back to the meeting. I'm so sorry. I felt that I've lost you all. I was trying to find my way back in. Sorry. So I was saying that I was looking into a different way of being an artist, of introducing myself into the art world, and that came in the beginning through an idea of participation or interaction of, so not having this idea of a viewer, but as a participant, and then of collaboration and collectivity. So, and that led me to kind of both to two different ways of practicing, or in a way of collaborating with other artists in long, durationally long projects, but also into thinking about artistic practice in a broader cultural production, which also led me to a bit of research on cultural democracy. And so I was also thinking about this question of why do I collaborate, or why to collaborate? And I think normally in a very candid way, I say that I collaborate in order to keep practicing, because I feel that when I have to work with other people, there's a sense of responsibility. So I show up to the game because I have someone else also depending on me. But then in fact, I think why do I collaborate and why to collaborate is because I think that there's still in it a sort of critique and a way of inhabit the art world in a different way. And then about how I experienced this process, I would say I found it challenging, which I think collaboration always is. And I think it was about the pace and the time of the conversation in the Frammapad. And then I really felt that it went super quick. I thought that when we're actually, okay, we've done our introductions, now we know more or less what we are talking about, time was up. So I'm really excited to continue the discussion here today.
Thank you, Carla. Yes, it did go very fast. Okay, Lily, do you want to go next?
Just unmute myself. Hi, everyone. So yeah, my name's Lily Hall, and as Lina said, I work currently as curator at the Showroom, which is a public contemporary art organisation that's based in northwest London. And I thought, just to keep concise, I'm going to read through this little intro section before we open up to the discussion, which I'm really looking forward to. But I'm reflecting on this introduction and questions about how my work connects fundamentally to these questions about collectivity and collaboration and network formation, and in that way foregrounding interdependency and crediting. I thought it would be useful to also say at this moment that at the Showroom we're a small core team of 4 and circumstantially female members, as well as a close-knit team of 3 gallery assistants and wider freelance technicians, and our current 10 board members. So just situating my current work, which is full-time, in relation to the others in this way, who make what we do publicly kind of possible at different scales and at different moments. But beyond this, I've been working both within and outside of different organisational and institutional structures over the past 15 years or so, and wearing different hats, as we all do, I think, in this group, as a curator, an editor, writer, coordinator, sometimes collaborator within an artist collective, at times teaching and producing. And these flow between long-term collaborations that are often rooted in friendships, or shorter-term durations, or in the case of the Showroom at the moment, slightly longer-term durations of explicitly paid work. So questions around collaboration and collectivity have been common denominators for me over these years. And within that, I think specifically the necessity of attending to the role and agency of an individual in relation to the whole, at whichever scale a given configuration of collaboration takes. And then the maintenance of those dynamics that involves always kind of shifting amounts of visible and invisible labour. So then, in terms of how I found the process of working together on the Frammapads, it's been a really nourishing time to reflect and to draw into focus some of these longer term inquiries that have been running through my practice, but also very much a larger proportion of the iceberg has stayed in my thoughts. I'm really aware rather than written down on the pad as much as I would have wanted to. So there's the challenge, I think, for me, but then really glad of this being a moment where we come together in dialogue and then building towards the future publication. So seeing it as a much longer term space to be involved within. I'm very glad of that. So yeah, looking forward to the discussion ahead.
Great, thank you, Lily. Abhijan, do you want to go next?
Hi, sorry, I was just turning my camera off because I seemed to be having some issues with it. But yeah, just to echo Lily's thoughts, I feel like what was great about this process, but also kind of, but also kind of daunting, was that the large part of what it inspired in us is still, I think, in our heads, and we need to spend some more time to draw these out. I have to be very honest that I wasn't the most present in these discussions, largely because and with my collective, and I think this is sort of this is sort of why I was invited onto this into this conversation. We've been incredibly overextended as well, and as we always say, the thing with collective work is it doesn't divide work but multiplies it. So this has kind of been the space that we've been trying to negotiate, especially as we're getting sort of more and more geographically spread out all over, although I am trying to work towards more spaces that we can actually inhabit together in person. I think, from our side, from when I say our, I mean my collective, the forest, or the forest curriculum, and I'll add a little bit about that in a bit. We do have certain practices and formulations, of how we respond to questions of authorship around and et cetera, which I'm really happy to share going forward. But I was asked by Lina to talk about another project that I'd been involved in, again, kind of collectively operated, called A Few in Many Places, which was a project by Cruz, which is an organization some of you may know, based between New York and Istanbul, and run by a really wonderful curator, Marie Spirito, that we'd been developing as one possible model for sort of interlocal collaboration and mutual support during COVID. And it's a project that we are now also in the process of understanding how this might, have these, might also inform the way that we continue to practice after the pandemic, because we've seen, I think, everywhere, but particularly in the West, this wonderful expansion of so many programs, particularly online panels about care and invisibilized labor, et cetera, over the pandemic. And now that the pandemic is over, we're back to not talking about care anymore. So it's been really wonderful to see how things can spring back, and witness that real time as well. But I think for us, what's important is to really think about taking seriously the lessons that we've learned from this situation, and thinking them not as exceptional, but rather as sort of symptomatic of other conditions that we are kind of facing in different ways. Should I just continue about the collective, or should I just leave it at that?
I think let's go around, and then we'll come back to more details. So thank you, Abhijan. Flick, do you want to go next? You're muted, I'm afraid.
Sorry. Right here. Hello, I'm Felicity Allen, also known as Flick. And a couple of things from my work. I think that the main reason that I've been invited to be part of this is because of the work I've done on the concept of the disoeuvre, which is, how to explain it briefly. Basically, it's a concept that I developed myself as a kind of idea, so therefore one can say I authored it, but based on looking back at my career and my work as an artist and the many interruptions that I'd experienced. And I was conscious, I became conscious, I had been conscious that some of the work that I made as in the interruption were actually a form of my practice, and that I was building on previous studio practices and other practices in order to make that work. And I remembered very well from the early 80s being introduced to an exhibition of Merit Oppenheim's work, and being told that actually the work was really inconsistent, and she was a one-hit wonder with her fur teacup. And that word inconsistent stayed with me, and stayed with me through the many periods of interruption in my own practice. And I always knew that it wasn't right. Just as in the 1970s, we'd been told that women's work was twee and decorative, the inconsistent was a way of apparently degendering it, but actually still making it very, very particular about having been marginalized. So that's where the concept of the disoeuvre came from. And then I thought, well, okay, this is my idea based on just my work. Let's take it out there. So in different ways, I've been exploring the concept and pushing the boundaries, seeing where its definitions might lie, basically, through talking and working with other people in different ways. And that's included conversations. It included an art historians conference panel earlier this year with people presenting different papers, and a particular group. Lina was involved in the group, and actually, of course, Jenny gave a paper. And then also I started doing a series of household exhibitions that I called the disoeuvre household exhibitions. So far I've done 2, and the last one, for me, it's interesting in thinking about, I've been thinking a lot today in preparation for today about the idea of the avant-garde group and the idea of the collective now. And I realized that the most recent household exhibition that I did was with a group of artists who didn't form an avant-garde, who didn't form a collective, but whose work I felt we could have some interesting discussions about. So visibly, they were distinct from one another, but in social terms, some of them had experienced similar things. So that's my work. I also just want to mention another bit of my work is around a commune that I was involved with in a very loose way in the 1970s. And it was a feminist commune and an it was that rural, and it was also educational. And I went there mainly initially because it was educational, and I was taking a year out from my very patriarchal and antediluvian undergraduate degree, and I went and spent a lot of time at this commune because it was hosting alternative educational workshops, basically through each summer, and I've been thinking a lot about that recently. I think in terms of Framapad, I've really enjoyed this process. It's been horrible pressure because, like everybody else, there's that anxiety about not having contributed enough, and about not having listened properly, about not having responded properly, and so on and so forth. But actually, I've really enjoyed this process of daring to put your foot in, or your mouth, your what is it, your fist in your mouth or whatever, somehow daring to do it, and then finding these things coming back and filtering up and into this. This feels like the most wonderful party to me. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, Flick. I think we all felt like that, and I at various points wrote to different people that had sent me sort of guilt-ridden emails saying no guilt, because we're all in it together. We're all struggling horribly, and it's wonderful, but it's also horrible, and it's stressful. And anyway, so over to manual labors. So I don't know how you two want to do this. I'll leave it to you. Who wants to speak first?
Jenny, you go. Do you want to go first?
Okay, sure. Hello. Yeah, my name's Jenny, and one half of Manual Labour. So we're here as a collective, or a collaborative practice. And yeah, as Lina was saying, we explore physical and emotional relationships to work, and that's often with workers in different fields of work. So I think the sort of relationship to collectivity is really kind of central in manual labours, because of course in the context of work we're just taught consistently about being an individual, about being hierarchical, about all of those structures that have come up in the Frammy pads, and so for Sophie and I, that kind of building or creating a space where collective conversation and through collective methods we can explore this and hopefully grow some kind of other relationships between colleagues or across different workforces is a kind of, I suppose, a political concern of the kind of work we do. And then I suppose more personally, yeah, I think it came up in the discussion last week as well, where one of the speakers brought up this idea of like, oh, but we're always collective, we're always interdependent, and this kind of myth of the individual, the independent person is yeah, something that we're just bombarded with, and how do we sort of consistently work against that? So in a way, yeah, collective work has yeah, I feel like for me it's just like the only way one works in a way, and also particularly in relationship to institutions of work or of education, where I'm now studying, you know, working or building particular communities of collective concern or practice has been a way of surviving those as well, where they're incredibly focused on those individualizing sort of technologies. Yeah, Soph, I don't know what you want to add in.
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. Just to, I mean, yeah, you've got a sense of the manual labours approach to collaboration and working with others, and I think Jenny and I came together accidentally, and then that was in 2013. Back in 2013, we had our first encounter, and I think that we both came with I guess an assumption that we always work with other people anyway, and haven't ever worked on our own, or at least I have never really worked on my own. Don't know how to do that, but also so it's a necessity. It's a political choice as well, in a resistance to being individualized and fragmented all the time. So I think that drive was a driving force for wanting to be you know, really excited about the possibility of joining a union when I started a salaried job, trying to find kind of ways of talking with others about concerns about where, you know, shared anger and where that leads, about shared concerns and issues, and yeah, finding overlaps and ways to work through that with others, and so I think the projects, or I don't know what they're more than manual labor. Oh, when you said manual labours is a project, I was like, it's not really a project. It's we struggle to define what it is, but if it's more like a life choice or something. And I find the same with, you know, the theories around cultural democracy, which I've tried to research and understand along with Carla over the years. I'm attracted to those concepts because it does dismantle the idea of modernist kind of notions of the artist, for example. So, and it comes from such a different perspective. So yeah, those sort of I guess shared interests and urgencies. Framapad. I love the name Framapad. It feels a bit like a sanitary product, and I think the experience of writing together, or at least in the same place, bit like a Google Doc, but color coded. I wanted it to be more less linear, and wanted to try and find ways we could layer each other's words. Or I know you could, you know, you can edit again, or not edit, like comment on the text as you went through, and we didn't really do that. But I guess I like the idea of reading and being able to respond to the words above. Again, did not manage to find the time to then do more read and responses that would have been, you know, some, I think Flick and Carla managed to do a few more like read and response actions. So yeah, the kind of the fact that this is part of a longer term conversation, hopefully, is was the point. Yeah, so that was good to be involved in from the beginning. Thank you.
Great, thank you all. So now we've heard all about how much we all struggled and how difficult it was to do this, in combining it with our day-to-day work and everything else we have to do in life. So if I could just ask now each of you, going back again to Carla, if you could, now let's talk about what we did manage to talk about. So if you could just select maybe one or two points that you found interesting, that were kind of, that resonated with you in our Framapad discussions. And then when we open up to the floor, hopefully around 6 o'clock, then everyone can respond to everyone else's, and we'll also invite everyone else to ask questions or any points at all. So Carla, if you just want to give us yours.
Yes, I can start. I picked a few. I thought of the capacity for collectivity, so being available, having time, and how that changes with age. And this was something that we talked about, the maintenance of collectivity, and which I thought also the role of friendship in collectivity, and how I thought as a young person, friendship led to collectivity, and today as an older person, I sometimes see collectivity as maintaining friendship as a way, kind of it goes around. So that was something that I was interested. And then rereading the Framapad back, there was something that Jenny brought, which it keeps resonating with me, which is it's something by Carla Lonzi, this Italian feminist, and about collaborating and being in dialogue with those who do not live in the same time and space as we do. And I thought that was really interesting, this idea of collaborating with people that are not longer with us, which I think is actually what a lot of people are doing with the work of Carla Lonzi at the moment. So I thought that was really interesting. And then also this question of homogeneity and difference in collective work, and how can we celebrate difference. And then I was thinking also of my own experience in collaboration and collective practice, where difference is actually really, really important, where I see that the work it doesn't develop from consensus and from making a compromise, but the opposite. A lot of time the work or the practice comes out of dissensus, out of disagreement. And then in that sense, it's not like in aspects of my own collaborative practice, is not like we're finding a common ground. We are forging a common ground by working together. And just to finish, there was something also really beautiful that Flick wrote towards the end about collaboration being an antidote to times of despair, which I really loved. And I thought of a Portuguese feminist collective from the 70s called the Three Marias. And they wrote a book with 6 hands. So they had this book, which is a collection of letters that they write to each other. And you don't really know who writes the letters of the poems. And the book and the collaborative effort in itself, they also analyze what they are doing all the time. And in some moments, they ask, well, what do we have at the end of this writing, of this collaboration? And then the answer that they give is that, what did we have before? Less, much less. And then they say, in the end, we shall go on alone, but we will feel less forsaken. And I thought it's sometimes, this collaboration is somehow a way of, resisting, doing things differently, and feeling less forsaken.
That's amazing. Thank you very much, Carla. Shall we move on to Lily? And please keep your questions and write them in the chat so that they don't escape. At least mine tend to. So, keep the questions in the chat or in your head, and we, hope that lots of things will come up. Lily, please go ahead.
Cool, thanks. I gave it a lot of thought today in the lead up to this, and rereading back through the Framapad, because there's so many points pick out on. Like we've been always saying, like the overlaps and the synergies are so strong, but picking on a couple. There's one around that came up a lot between us all around this question of the growth narrative and the sort of neoliberal conditions that we're kind of all working within, of like the language, and specific, like Lina, you raised it in your introductory like remarks as well around the specifics of language of scaling up that tie in with that growth narrative. And maybe I'm in this mindset because we've also been in this kind of NPO process funding scenario at the showroom recently, and how to sort of work with and in relation to or against counter that scaling up narrative or find other language. And with that, kind of bringing in the work of a feminist economist called Catherine Gibson, who really addresses this question of scaling up. And for that, I've got artist Catherine Bond to thank, who I've been working with closely over recent years, for this question of like scaling out rather than scaling up, maybe as a possible route to work with that relates to kind of working like more one-to-one, like this kind of scale of discussion that we're having together, that then can resist or like create a different scenario where the kind of abstractions or extraction that can come out of these other modes of working, more capitalist and expansionist ways of working. So that's just, kind of looping back to that, the conversation around growth narratives that are at odds often with collectivity. And then there was a point that we also often came back to around this kind of the resting on singular authorship, and this phrase that's of like cleaning up of collectivity, of trying to, maybe this also often happens in more institutional contexts of kind of there's so much work that goes underneath the tip of the iceberg that then often gets kind of settled into naming an individual author. Again, this is like the importance of language around crediting and consent within that for all those involved in a process. But again, it goes back to maintenance and the energies that need to go in any situation of any collaboration around, like going in together into like deciding upon this of consenting to and crediting around even the decision of the cleaning up or not of singular authorship. So those are just a couple of reflections. And whether we can have a blueprint, which I really do doubt, that we kind of always have to return to the specifics of the here and now in a collaborative context.
Great, thank you. Great points, Lily. Thank you. Abhijan, do you want to go next?
Sure. I'd be really happy to, and thank you to both Carla and to Lily for those really wonderful points, particularly around what you said about dissensus and its relationship to collectivity, and Lily, this question of scaling out instead of scaling up as something. It's interesting because like reflecting on that, I feel like that's been a part of our practice, but we've never really put it in those terms. But it feels very useful to think with. And maybe just to respond, I mean, and this is sort of like kind of, things are kind of falling into, kind of coming into perspective for me on this panel too, just because I was invited to talk about this particular project, I didn't really introduce a lot of the ways in which we within our collective have dealt with these issues. And maybe I could just take a moment to do that, because while the Many Places is a project that I'm very, very proud of, I think these questions of authorship, etc., have been something that we've been working with. I mentioned at the beginning that like my collective is the shorthand for the name of our collective is Forest Curriculum, because it's not actually called that. Because fundamentally, the Forest Curriculum is a thing that we are trying to build, and our collective is nameless. It's a thing that it is a collective project in that sense, but that becomes a bit harder to put in an email in an email chain. But and it requires some explanation. Part of the reason for this is because we are sort of we are an anarchist collective, and our practice has been owes a lot to 2,000 years of anti-state resistance in Southeast Asia, Southern China, and Northeast India, we think about this idea of the and others as being the many entities, beings, humans, non-humans, that have produced these conditions, that have, you know, practiced that and produced these conditions of a kind of anarchist imaginary, who we will never be able to know whether it, because the ideas of holding on to history are incredibly different. And so we're always sort of, you know, we're always kind of in this kind of transmillennial dialogue with these and others within the collective. But it's also in another sense, it's also to kind of leverage whatever cultural capital the collective is what is construed upon the collective on as many people as possible, because the you know, cultural capital is sort of like one of these last unredistributed resources within the art world, right? And to think about how to redistribute that. So part of the way that we do it is whenever we're making a work, we name as many people as we possibly can include within that. And for us, what we think about is not so much a relationship of authorship, but a relationship of citation. And citation as this kind of like you know, I mean, like this entire thing about the ethical status of citation is incredibly popular to talk about now. So I'm not going to bore anyone with details around this. But for example, it was just really funny because right before I was jumping on this call, I was responding to an email about about a collection that wanted to buy this work that we'd reproduced, and they were incredibly confused about why we had said like 15 people for the forest curriculum. And this is sort of how we try to resolve this. A part of this is also just because a lot of it, most of us come from the global south, so mobility and access to resources, etc., are a real issue. And we have found that by leveraging this kind of cultural capital, by saying, like, even if somebody did not actually like hammer a nail into a work, or whatever kind of like edit on a Google Doc that we were kind of all collectively researching on, that their contribution has been valuable. And this also means that they can leverage that to get, for example, we were just today, we were celebrating one of our collective members getting their right of residence in Berlin. And we were able to leverage our collective cultural capital to do that, to help them. We've helped people get out of situations of political precarity. We've helped people mobilize and organize using the name of the collective, because it would otherwise be impossible for them to within the spaces that they're operating in. And for us, this thing of always naming and always citing becomes this gesture to like fuck with that system, if I may.
Great. Thank you. There's some very useful tactics there, what you just said. Thank you. Okay, Blake or Felicity. Should be.
Thank you, Lina. Thanks. I just want to raise something that I'm not sure I picked up on in our conversation. I'm not sure how much it was there, but I thought about it today, particularly in relation to the essay that you have, or article that you have, Lina, on the And Others website, which for me personally was completely fascinating to read. And you talk about what constitutes authorship, and that I think that kind of, it feels really critical to the relation to the concept of the disoeuvre and also the collective, to me. So I really wished I had personally tried to explore that more on Framapad with the rest of you, and I hope that in one way or another we might do that. I think one of the things that really struck me was that in trying to create this idea, okay, I came up with the word the disoeuvre. It comes from the French word oeuvre, and I just put a dis in front of it. And then I discovered that you could play, other people told me how you could play with it. You could play with it in terms of who deserves recognition. I credit Alexandra Caccoli with having initially said that to me, and so on and so forth. So different people have come up with different plays on the word and allowed it to expand in that way. So you could say, because I came up with the word, I was the author of it. It becomes very clear to me. Immediately I start talking about it and other people respond. That actually everybody's thinking it. It doesn't matter what the word was really, but in your essay, Lina, you describe the way in which the person who came up with the idea in the OHO group was conceived to be the author of the idea. And for me, that's kind of, I just think that's so interesting, because we all know how ideas work, and they don't belong to one person. We all know that. We all experience that all the time. But one of the things that we haven't talked about so much here, and maybe some of the things that some of you have said has raised it, is the question of recognition, and how actually it seems to me that there's a very basic primal human need to feel that one is recognized. And one of the things that neoliberalism institutes is the impossibility of ever feeling recognized, and always feeling left out, and always feeling in the wrong place at the wrong time, or whatever, except for a moment. Maybe some people feel differently from that, but there's a kind of way in which I think that kind of the ways in which the collective does or doesn't recognize, and doesn't, what you've been saying, Carla, about forging collectivity, the ways, and I think Sophie mentioned the significance of difference, the significance of argument and difference in collectivity. And certainly my memory of the 1970s collectives that I was largely peripheral to, nobody would, I was around, but I wasn't embedded. Maybe unfortunate way of describing it, really. However, I think that one of the things that people found so difficult to deal with in my memory from that time was the intensity of conflict, and the degree of conflict, and how to cope with it, particularly because a lot of us were sort of attached to ideas of pacifism and certainly anti-war, kind of allegiances in that period. So I found that really interesting. I also, in the two other points I just wanted to mention from the Framapad conversations, was the one around objects and process, let's say, or performance, and the conflict and potential tensions there. And when I saw those potential tensions, I thought, oh no, dare I say this? And then I took a deep breath and I did dare say it. And I was so touched that you didn't get rid of me. You didn't boot me out. It was so nice of you. Thank you. But it was that kind of, those tensions that around really big issues that from my memory, were really significant back in the day. And it's kind of great to be able to have different allegiances in that way. And finally, the last thing, which I went on about, and I think we've all mentioned, is the question of administration. And the one thing that I just feel like perhaps we didn't quite articulate is how devastatingly boring administration actually is to do. And the reason that we all hate it, I mean, I don't know, but I imagine most of us would prefer to clean the floor and then have someone walk on it with muddy boots and then clean it again, rather than doing administration. I don't know, but personally that would be my preference.
Thank you, Flick. I tend to agree with you. Yeah, anything but admin. But hey, yeah, that's not what my day-to-day life says. It's all admin. Exactly. Anyway, thank you very much. So many great points there. Okay, so manual labors in whichever order you choose, and then we'll open up to discussion, hopefully yeah, shortly after 6.
You want to go first, Soph?
Okay, I will do a quick thing. We had a few different things, didn't we? We were going to flag up, and I'm going to choose the one about, because it hasn't, I don't think it's come up so much yet, is around that relationship to institutions, and a few people mentioned it on the Framapad. And I think for me that is about the misfit, or the kind of the struggle around deciding you want to work in a certain way, making kind of a decision making about what kind of relationships you're building, and the way you want to work, which is often quite antithetical to and kind of sometimes impossible within the structures we work within. I'm thinking of the university, Lina, as well, but often other institutions that are, for example, majority of publicly funded institutions in the UK are set up as charities, which are kind of fundamentally structurally unequal and exclusionary, and not necessarily set up for a kind of collective way of working and decision making, indeed are not accessible. So I think the kind of mismatch, or the kind of the contradictions and struggles around those moments, and that's something that Jenny and I have found, and end up talking to people quite a lot about, the wanting to be a certain way, and the structure they're in not allowing them to be that person. So that can be, in terms of the call centre we've worked with, with staff there, or a cultural organisation, when we kind of try and talk to people about their working conditions, these mismatches and contradictions are often at the nub of it, as well. And so I think kind of Flick's appreciation and bravery, but also I think really important point about getting to those moments of friction, or moments of actually, what do we think about this? It's okay for us to not know, or to be open to experience another perspective or point of view. So I think that's something that I guess we come across all the time with our work, because we're all different and we have different experiences. And I think within manual labours, we're trying to find the kind of right facilitation processes and spaces to do that. So I think I'm going to different points, but I think the question of administration is really key, and I would big up administration. So one of the things I teach at college's arts management and cultural policy, and I run a module called Inside Out of Culture, Theories and Institutions, and we read, one of the texts we read for that is Andrea Frank and Ross Jardine's piece on bureaucracy labour. And it's such a good reminder of the fact that administration is, I think we all know it's undersold and undervalued, but also as a kind of creative practice, and one that is I'm reading kind of as a form of maintenance, of facilitation of care, and let's be honest, 99% of our jobs, whether you're in a university, freelance, or an artist, whatever you call yourself, most of your days will be full of admin and that kind of work. So kind of reclaiming it as something more joyful and relational as well, and is perhaps one way through this, rather than the chore that it becomes. But Jenny, over to you.
Thanks, Sophie. Yeah, thanks so much, everyone, and also on the Framapad, so many interesting perspectives and thoughts on tactics as well, of kind of what the collective enables, and what forms of politicization or resistance it can afford. And I think Carla also mentioned this, but I think one thing Sophie and I have talked a lot about as well when working in the context of the workplace with groups of people who often haven't met before or don't know each other at all, because of the way work is structured and the hierarchies within it, is just how a collective can found itself on difference rather than homogeneity. And then, of course, how that relates to access and privilege, cut across race, gender, class, disability. And so that, for me, touches on this importance of both like an intersectional but also intergenerational approach to collective work, and that works against that sort of, I suppose, collective practice as being sort of something presented as those for something, yeah, for people with enough youth or whiteness to be part of. So what kind of privileges enabled you to take part in the collective, I suppose. And I think that really touches on a brilliant text that Lina and Irene wrote on the sick and unwilling curator as well, and kind of thinking around who has the time and capacity, because we all know collective work takes more time, like to be involved in collective practice and collective formation, and how does that relate to care needs, workers, carers, parenting, etc. So yeah, I think that was something it'd be really great to sort of continue discussing further. And then Sophie and I were also talking about like the reproduction of collectivity, and I suppose that again relates to this administration, the emotional labor of administration, the creative labor of administration, and I thought that's been brilliant also brought up as well by Abhijan as well, this use of the name as well, like as a kind of really important tool. But I suppose I was just thinking a lot in my own, how that's underestimated, not only by the kind of structures or institutions that we're working with, or it's completely invisibilized, but also like how I do that myself, like, you're just always sort of like squashing this work, and actually it's the most important, and how to kind of center that in a way is something I suppose I'm trying to battle with, or think how to do that, and how to bring joy to that as well, like, because it feels like it's those moments in the work Sophie and I've been doing anyway, where where that sort of builds these effective relations with other people that can be a kind of grounding for forging some kind of collective or collective practice. So I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you all so much. I feel like we should, if time allowed, I feel like we should take like 10 minutes to just like for all these things to settle and then start discussing. I think we have one question in the chat. Before that, I just wanted to say, just following on from what Jenny was talking about who can collaborate and who is able to be part of these networks. I think what was very interesting for me in the process of gathering this network is how apparent it already became, how the way that networks form is so informed by people's situations, time, access, all of these things that we are discussing, in a way became evident as I was trying to put together this group of collaborators. And, for instance, there were artists for whom this level of engagement and this level of commitment is just not doable. It's just not possible. If every fee matters, you just can't, engage in a durational project like this. So in a way, like the question of network reproduction and network formation already is kind of answering itself for me in the process of kind of how we all came together. But we have lots and lots of questions. So I'm gonna take a little take the back seats, take a step back, and let Kat or the people who are asking questions just go ahead. And if people want to turn their cameras on, that would be really nice actually at this point. So we're right on track. So that's great. So I don't know if we want to start with Ed's question. Hi, Ed.
Do you want me to read it out? So I was wondering whether the question of the author is one that might be addressed within the broader question of what is authority, And I come to that from reading Hannah Arendt's essay, which places authority in the context of a center, particularly of an origin. And so there's something for me about, say, for example, the way that group identity is often imposed from the outside or externalized. There's a question about ways in which groups can perform authority or perform collectivity without allowing a center to be imposed on them or without projecting a center. And that seems to be an important structural principle.
Thank you. That's a really, really good question. Does anyone want to respond to that? I mean, I can just say very briefly, perhaps in relation to the text that I wrote as part of this project that Flick mentioned earlier, that something that's been core to me is this dichotomy or the kind of clash between external articulations of collectivity and the internal processes and the gaps in that. And what I've found is that, I mean, this has been discussed. Of course, for me, I can't remember what's been discussed in which Framapad. That's the glitch in the in the process. But somewhere there was a discussion about how the moment the kind of the collectivity reaches publicness and has to present itself externally, there is a shift in gear or a shift in articulation or a shift in the way that work is talked about. And I think that's something that we all kind of, that it keeps coming up. And also, I think that for me also relates to this idea of duration that we talked about that really came up in our Framapad, in our conversation, which is to do with how collectivity and one's relation to collectivity changes over time in life at different points in one's career, work, different relationships to who we are, how we perceive ourselves, how we're feeling about ourselves, all of those things. Like it's kind of like something that's constantly shifting. And I think that has to do with articulations of ourselves in relation to others, in relation to collectivity. Like, for instance, I think I probably articulate things and think of myself differently if I'm in full-time employment and I feel secure versus if I'm kind of, you know, looking out for the next gig and kind of trying. It's like one has a very different sense of self also. But I think that question about authority and authorship, it's a really interesting one that I'd like to think about more. But I think that kind of like two ways of thinking, in the same way that we present ourselves through our CVs and through these linear narratives that I think Flick's work is trying to shake up and undo a little bit, that you're kind of progressing, like this idea of progress, artistic progress or creative progress, that you're like, you're, you know, early career and then mid-career and then you're somehow wonderful and everything connects. And I think that's really, really deeply problematic, especially in relation to collectivity and working together. So that probably doesn't all kind of answer what your question or your point, but perhaps someone else wants to come in at this point.
I just want to say thank you for that. It's a very helpful question and response to that, and it's something I'm going to be thinking about more. One of the things, obviously, that is a kind of hangs on it really for me is the question of not just artistic authority but of artistic responsibility. And I do think there is a kind of, for me, this question around I suppose it's the ethical artist kind of idea, that how do you, if you're working with people, how do you work ethically and how do you take responsibility for that? And is authority and in order to take the responsibility, at some point you have to take authority. That I'm talking from a very practical point of view.
Carla.
Yes, I can add to that because I've been thinking also about authorship and authority coupled, and especially in projects where you collaborate with non-artists. So not so much when you're working with your peers, but when you're working with a group of people. And it does, I think, following up a little bit what Flick was saying, you know, there's this sense of you are the artist, you're leading a project, you have a certain responsibility, and people see their authority, that place of authority, you know, as you as a leader, or as a proponent, or as the artist. And then also thinking through this idea, you're doing I'm thinking of a specific project where the proposal was to do a collaborative practice, you know, starting from zero with a group of people, and trying to do an artistic gesture with a collective. And then there's still this idea, how do you author this work? And also clashing with, for example, the organization of the exhibition, who in the end wants to do a recognizable artist and others, right? Plus, and how also, I was thinking of Abhijan as well, you know, there's always a limited space to put authorship in banners, in catalogs. When you come with a list of 50 people, it becomes also a clash. But also in the sense of, because I had a lot of difficulties as well, in the sense of having to embody that place of authority, and how can you level up. And then it led me to think also in this idea of power not being a given thing, but being a relationship. And so you also have, you know, power distributes itself. So it might be that you're in a moment as the artist, as the leader, you're in a position of power. And then in the next moment, maybe the people you are working with are in a position of power because they would have a knowledge that you don't have, you know. So then as this shifts, it becomes as well more fluid. But I do agree with you that they can become coupled.
Thank you, Carla. So we have Kirsten, who's raised her hand, and a question from Helena about what's the best way to ask questions. So Helena, if you want to ask a question, maybe if you go after Kirsten.
Hi. I thought I'd put my hand down. That's how inept I am with Teams. Sorry if I blipped. No, I was just sort of ahead of what Carla was speaking about. I was thinking about the psychology of collaboration, Lina, in response to what you were saying there about the capacity or the ability to be able to participate or collaborate. And I think for me, the thing I've always thought about with collaboration is it's about how much you're prepared to give away and how much you're prepared not to gain from a process. And that's kind of counterintuitive and negates the idea, you know, you need something already, you need to possess something already to be able to give some of that away. So it's this kind of inverse that it's a destabilizing position to take without institutional context to work in, or without, you know, some kind of security in some wider way. So I just wanted to echo what you were saying and think about that psychology of collective practice in some way as well.
And to me, that also really relates with the idea of confidence and the idea of sort of putting oneself forward and kind of being in a position to want to be part of something like that, and kind of being able to articulate what you're doing and to kind of put yourself in that position. And that already takes a lot, I think.
Yeah.
I think Jenny and Helena, I am not sure if you have a question. Maybe you do. Okay, so Jenny and then Helena and then Lily, as far as I can tell.
I think Helena, you were first. You want to go? Or?
All right, actually it's more of a, I just want to kind of chime in on the side of administration, maybe because I started work as a secretary. So I was very aware of that invisible labor. But I think when I've done freelance work and I've been really well supported by colleagues, I've realized how valuable good organization is, and that it is a form of care. And I think in a way I was thinking about that famous essay from the early 70s, The Tyranny of Structurelessness, by Joe Freeman, and think about, you know, the tyranny of administrativeness, whatever that word would be. But, you know, when something's well organized and people take responsibility and are clear about roles, that can be incredibly freeing. and that work is often carried out by the lesser paid and the lesser valued members of organisations. So I thought that was a really interesting bit of the conversation.
Yes, absolutely. As it happens earlier, I had a conversation with actually the funders of this project, where exactly these questions came up about who is doing the work and the invisible labor and all that, which I thought was, this sort of started off as a formal discussion and then ended up much more personal, which I found fascinating, that we're kind of all, you know, picking up on these things, which are so crucial and so kind of maybe under theorized, I'm not sure, but don't have enough visibility and enough of a platform, I think. Okay, so Jenny and Lily.
Thanks, Lina. Yeah, that just really makes me think also of your work and Kat's work in kind of holding this collective. Like also with the framing pads, I would have loved to have contributed more. So I can't profess I did loads of writing, but I think your work in kind of like, you know, drawing out some of those themes and kind of holding the collective, I really value that. And yeah, I was just thinking about that earlier comment on authorship and authority, and it just made me think about relationships to precarity, and I suppose who can be named. I suppose I think about our work, Sophie, and when people are talking about, you know, horrible situations at work, the working conditions, and the kind of precarity of naming themselves, like the importance of anonymity in order to be able to have a voice. So those experiences don't then become a way of sort of being punished or fired from work. So I think, I was thinking about that. And then I was also thinking about whether, and I sort of thinking about reciprocity and reciprocity of relations as another way of thinking through this sort of binary of authorship or authority.
Yeah, thank you. All great points to return to. Okay, Lily, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I think it's going to become a sort of echoing and chiming in with what Helena you just said and Jenny too just now, but around, and yeah, it's been covered, but around the role of like clear organising and administration in enabling conditions, where speaking back to the question earlier about, you know, how much you have to give to a collaboration or to take from a process that's reciprocal. And then also responsibility, though, of which comes back to organising for creating spaces where people maybe who don't shout the loudest or don't feel confident to speak up then can, and that in itself isn't, if a space is convened in a way that enables people, like I feel like this one has been, to speak on, you know, from the position that they're able to. Different levels of administration or organising clarity will just enable that more so than others, or can be, and without it can become very exclusionary. I think we also, like the panel last week as well, talked about that, of like anarchy structurelessness sometimes being like, you know, like the collective will be this like amorphous whole that doesn't need that administrative labor to kind of to give a structure that people can contribute within. You can otherwise end up in these sort of reproducing the conditions that we're seeking to often counter, just because that work hasn't been done. Meandering response to different things, but
no, I just wanted to, Jenny, I was just wondering if you wouldn't mind sharing the book that you mentioned about bureaucracy, or the article by Andrea something. Yeah, that would be really wonderful. I think it would be quite resonant for a lot of things we're thinking about. Yeah, I just wanted to kind of like just jump in and just like frame a little bit about what was already talked about in terms of questions of administration. I mean, I think that, I mean, with the generation that we belong to, you know, in terms of practice, is also one that learns a lot from your generations, etc. And I think for us it's also been really instructive to like look at the kind of the failures, or sort of where some of these ideas kind of got stuck, in a sense, where I guess to the particular generation, administration came as a surprise at the end of certain kinds of experimentation. And I think for us, because having seen that unfold, administration or bureaucracy as being a very key place where kind of our activism or activist imaginations have to be engaged has been a really big part of what we've been thinking about. Also in relation to the fact that bureaucracy and administration is essentially how violence is normalized and practiced in every day, both to and towards those that are upon whom it is administering, but also the labors that are performing, the bodies that are performing that labor as well. And it's sort of it's a structure. I mean, which is also why I would hesitate to kind of like talk about this kind of aestheticization of administration, of like, oh, we need to think about these ideas of care, etc., etc. And in administration, no, we need to acknowledge them as the form, as the violence of the everyday, and think against them, and think about rather think towards these forms of kind of collective accountability, etc. But in a kind of creative sense that as some of the previous speakers also brought up, I was thinking a lot about this wonderful book called Divergences by Miriam Stoney. That just came out, and it's a really wonderful book of poetry that she wrote as a sort of a kind of anti-love letter to a figure called Frank, who's been chasing her for her student loans. And it's a really beautiful, and I think it's a really beautiful take on questions of administrative anonymity and violence, and how many of our bodies experience it. Just that.
How do you ask for?
Yeah, we can hear you. It's okay.
Oh, can I join in? I just wanted to say that's very interesting. One of the things that I have thought about talking about but haven't, there's an organization called Refugee Tales, which is it's a complex organization. It does a number of different things with refugees, and one of the things that a very interesting lawyer who was involved with it was talking about in terms of human rights, was that there needs to be an additional human right, which is the right to treat people properly or decently, which of course, if we're thinking about administration, we're thinking about the Home Office and how it's dealing with people around border controls and migration and so on and so forth. We know perfectly well that there are many, many people working in the Home Office who absolutely can't bear what they're being asked to do and find it powerfully offensive, and appropriately so. So I think that there is something around administration which maybe isn't just about creativity and even about efficiency, but it's also about decency. That's really important.
Yeah, very important point. Absolutely. Okay, Abhijan, if you could put a link to the book that you mentioned, there is a request for that. I would like it too. That would be really great. Okay, I think we're kind of coming up to the end. I must say I struggled between sort of trying to engage with the Framapads and the kind of infrastructure of it, and I thought, there we go, I've done it again. I'm not able to engage with the content because I'm having to sort of think about the website and things like that. But in the end, I think we're all in the same place, in that we enjoyed it, we wanted more, we couldn't get more, and now we move into whatever the next stage is. I'm just going to very quickly read a comment from Linda Miller, who says, very interesting comment about the right to treat people decently. That is a moral inquiry equivalent to that experienced by healthcare workers unable to give the quality of care that they would want to, which is, yeah, Althea Greenan says, wonderful point. So yeah, I think that's a really valid and important point that does kind of open it up to actually other spheres as well. So I think we've done very well. We've had a good sort of engaged discussion, and I think it is 6:30, and as promised, we should draw to a close. So I want to just say what happens next. So the next panel is the question is ephemerality freedom? And it's that question that we also touched on here a little bit. What happens if you take the object, the art object, the object that normally the value is centered on, away, and if the collaborative process is ephemeral. It doesn't kind of culminate in something sort of tangible, even though that's kind of problematic in itself. In any case, that's on the 18th of November, so in a week's time, more or less. As we said, there's a website, and we are going to work towards a publication. So I just want to say a big thank you to everyone, and it's been fantastic, and obviously the conversation continues. And thank you to those who came this evening, and I hope that you'll join us again for the remaining two panels. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.